I fought City Hall, and by the end of this video, you're gonna find out whether or not I won. Alright, so I got a moving violation, a $170 ticket for taking an on-ramp onto a bridge when that on-ramp was apparently reserved for carpool traffic, buses, and taxis. What? You know about it. I spent a couple of days complaining about it. I contested that ticket on the basis that I'll save my contestation for later. Today I'm going to court for a live reading of the judgment because the judge actually took it under deliberation, which is already a victory. But I need a real victory, not a moral victory. Like as in a victory saying you don't have to pay the ticket because I don't want to tell you my defense yet. Right now I gotta take the kids to school, my wife to work, go to an actual law business meeting that allows me to actually support a family. Then to court for the reading and back to finish this up. But in the meantime, when you go to court, you can't go dressed like this. Pro tip number 1, when you go to court, dress reasonably well, not too fancy. You're there to show respect to the court, but not to show off your clothing. Luckily, I don't have any clothing that is show-off clothing. This is a $200 Simon suit with this is like a $50 shirt, which is not cheap, but it's not show-off. I kept the socks, though. Before we can actually start talking about evidence, we need to talk about what needs to be proven, and in that sense, you're going to need to know what exactly you're being accused of.
What we're talking about.
Evidence. You have to know what the prosecution has to prove in order to know what your defense has to be. There are 3 types of, call them crimes or infractions. You have your mens rea infraction, you have your strict liability infraction, and you have your strict liability? No. Strict responsibility and absolute responsibility. Mens rea means that they have to prove the intent to have committed the act that is the crime, which is not the same thing as proving the intent to commit the crime. Take, for example, destruction of currency. If you set a $1 bill on fire, all that the prosecution is going to have to prove is that you set the $1 bill on fire and that you set the $1 bill on fire on $1 bill. We haven't had a $1 bill in 20 years. The example would be, I deliberately lit the $1 bill to light a cigar. Floyd Mayweather, I'm looking at you. If you didn't know that it was illegal to destroy federal currency, it doesn't matter. All that the prosecution would have to prove is that you lit the bill on fire and you intended to light the bill on fire. Mens rea, actus reus, they have to prove the actus reus, the act of the crime, and the mens rea, the intent to have committed the act, which is the crime. We'll get into strict responsibility and absolute responsibility after I drop my wife off at work. Cheers. Alright, I just stopped at a Poutine place on the way to the courthouse because I gotta get something to eat before sitting down for the joy of listening to the judgment to be read orally before it is handed to me on paper. And for anyone who's familiar with Montreal, this place is called Hippie Poutine on the corner of Saint-Denis and Rigaud. I ordered a Glasgow Poutine. Regardless, everybody knows that poutine is the cornerstone to an awesome lunch in Quebec. Okay, so we've talked about mens rea crimes, and now we're going to talk about strict responsibility versus absolute responsibility crimes. Infractions, penal infractions, whatever. Strict liability basically means that the Crown, the prosecutor, does not need to prove intent. They just need to prove that you did it, because otherwise it would just be impossible on a broader scale to prosecute those types of infractions, and the easiest one that comes to mind are parking infractions. Strict liability. Doesn't matter if you didn't see the sign. If you parked somewhere between the hours where you were not allowed to, the Crown does not need to prove that you intended to commit the infraction. They just need to prove that you did it and you have to pay up. But strict responsibility allows for the defense of due diligence, reasonable diligence. Absolute responsibility means that even a due diligence is not a satisfactory defense to the infraction or the crime itself. And now I realize that I've been saying absolute responsibility instead of absolute liability throughout this vlog, and I'm gonna have to go back now and like dub over responsibility with the term liability. Strict liability and absolute liability. In the context of absolute liability, mistake of fact is not a valid defense. So take, for example, certain... Oh yes, thank you very much. Here's the poutine. All right, we're going to come back to the legal discussion after I devour this. That's good. That's good. Okay, and just to finish up on the absolute liability versus the strict liability and the differences in proof, and incidentally why I was making the mistake calling it absolute responsibility. In French, it's referred to as responsabilité absolue versus responsabilité stricte. So that's sort of the anglicism or franchicisme, as I say, whatever. The differences between absolute liability and strict liability is in the defenses. Mistakes of fact and due diligence are legitimate defenses in strict liability, but not in absolute liability. And taking the example of statutory sexual offenses, the defense that I thought this person was over a certain age is not a legitimate defense. There are incidentally other legitimate defenses, such as I actually took every measure possible, I asked for identification, and I didn't know that the ID that I got was in fact fake ID. Fake ID? All right, and just to add something here, because absolute liability is even a bigger onus on the accused than strict liability, there are even stricter rules of application for what constitutes, an infraction with absolute responsibility. You need something? In determining if we are dealing with an infraction of absolute liability, we need to look at the overall regulatory pattern. We need to look at the subject matter of the legislation, the importance of the penalty, and the precision of the language. Used in the statute. There, that's it. Okay, that's what you need to look at, because if an infraction is of absolute responsibility, it is going to be detailed and specified in the infraction itself, in the statute, in the regulation, whatever. Now we're going to get back to this video. Oh, should we get back to the video? Okay, back to the video. In terms of speeding, which is also absolute responsibility, it's not a question of saying I didn't know that I was speeding or I didn't know what the speed limit was. Driving while intoxicated is another pretty good example of an absolute liability offense. The defense that I didn't know I was over the legal limit or I thought I had drunk enough not to be over the legal limit are not legitimate defenses. That said, in most jurisdictions, you will in fact have the involuntary intoxication defense. A totally hypothetical but perfect example would be you buy a can of Coke at a dépanneur and you don't know that there was some error in the production line at Coca-Cola such that that was actually filled with rum and Coke, and you drank it and involuntarily got intoxicated and didn't know that you were above the legal limit. That might be a legitimate defense of involuntary intoxication because there was absolutely no expectation that you would get intoxicated from a product that was never intended to have alcohol in it. But now moving from that hypothetical to my concrete infraction, I got a ticket, a $170 ticket for accessing a bridge from an on-ramp that was reserved but only for certain hours of the day for buses, taxis, and carpool. And when I used this ramp to access the bridge, I was alone in the car during the hours when it was reserved for carpooling, meaning I had to have at least one other person in the car in order to qualify as a carpool and be able to use the access ramp during those hours. This is, in fact, a strict liability offense, meaning that I can use as a legitimate defense due diligence. Now, due diligence for these types of infractions, parking tickets, etc., are not just as simple as saying, I didn't see the sign. Too bad, you have to look around and verify what the applicable rules are based on the relevant signage, which should be visible. And therein lies my defense. Inadequate signage is, in fact, a legitimate defense to strict liability infractions. And as relates to this particular on-ramp, this is an on-ramp to Montreal's largest bridge. There's no reason why anyone would intuitively think that there's any form of a restriction in terms of using this on-ramp to get onto the bridge, let alone during certain hours of the day. And even if one were aware of it, the signage for this particular on-ramp was absolutely inadequate, insufficient, and I dare say almost entrapment. I got this ticket on the third day of using the on-ramp, and every day before I noticed that there were about 10 to 15 cars pulled over with policemen on the side of the road, and I was wondering what on earth they were getting pulled over for. I just thought everyone was talking on their cell phone, and the cops were sitting there picking one off after the other as to people, driving with a cell in their hands. And it was only on the third day when I got pulled over for the first time, I wasn't on my cell phone and I couldn't understand why I was getting pulled over, that I was told by the policeman that this is in fact reserved for carpools during the hours of 3 and 7 in the afternoon. And I was like, where is the sign? And the signs were in fact immediately at the on-ramp of the ramp itself. Just right there. As you get on, it's like, oh, there's the sign. What am I going to do now? And then I put it all together that for the previous 3 days, each and every car that I saw was getting pulled over after the signage because none of them knew that this on-ramp was reserved for carpool lanes between the hours of 3 and 7. So I contested the ticket. My defense was going to be inadequate signage. I asked the policeman to come as a witness, and I requested a bunch of documents from the prosecuting attorney. And the documentation I asked for were the designs, the discussions surrounding where to put these signs, and I also asked for a list of how many people got pulled over at that spot for the same infraction. Because I knew from my own observation that there were easily 10 to 20 people getting pulled over a day at that spot on the basis of that infraction. And if that many people are getting pulled over, it's not the people's fault, it's the signage fault. As anticipated, the city said, we're not going to provide you with that information, it's totally irrelevant, blah, 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 and I expected as much, and I wasn't about to send subpoenas to municipal officials asking for the documentation. I had made my request, and the fact that they refused to provide the documentation could even be interpreted as evidence in support of my position. But the policeman came, and I asked the policeman how many people he pulled over over that month, that week, that day. And his response was, I don't know, I'd have to go check my records. And I said, well, that's nice. I did ask for this information, which none of you have brought. But if I were to suggest that you had pulled over easily 20 people that day, might that seem possible? And the policeman admitted, yeah, I could have pulled over 20 people easily that day, which as far as I am concerned is all the evidence I need to prove that the signage is patently inadequate when so many people are getting tickets for that infraction.
But wait, there's more!
Knowing what I had to prove, I prepared documentation. The first thing that I prepared was case law, jurisprudence. Jurisprudence to the effect that inadequate signage is a perfectly good defense for why someone did not know that what they were doing was in fact illegal. And I shall read from my case law.
Ces panneaux ne deviennent visibles pour lui qu'au moment même où il s'engage à l'endroit interdit.
The signs only become visible at the very moment the individual is doing that which is forbidden.
Une signalisation installée de cette façon élude à toute fin utile le but inhérent de la signalisation routière.
Signage placed in such a manner eludes for all practical purposes the inherent purpose of signage in the first place. Checkmate. But wait, there's more! I printed up Google Map aerials so that the judge could see where the signage was in relation to the actual on-ramp. You can't see anything! You can't see anything! That actually just got stuck to the window. You can't see anything. It's amazing. And in cross-examination, the attorney shows me like the full 3D real-time Google Maps. And she asks me, if I were to suggest that there's roughly 50 meters between where you turned left and where you accessed the ramp, would you be able to say yes or no? And I said, even looking at her image, I said, I don't know if it's 50 meters, but look at what you're showing me. I can't even see the sign from what you're showing me on Google Earth. And I argued all this masterfully and skillfully, if I do say so myself, and the judge took it under deliberation. Now, when I say that this is a moral victory to begin with, typically judges don't take contestations of traffic violations under deliberation. That is to say that they're going to go think about it and render a written judgment. And one of the reasons why I like to think that the judge took this under deliberation was so that he would not acquit me in front of a full courtroom and have a number of other people invoke the same defense. All right, now I'm going to the municipal court to hear the live reading of the judgment. I'm not going to record it in the courtroom because it's illegal, but now I'm going to go find out if I win and I'm the smartest person on the living face of this earth, or if I lose, a dummy out $170 plus 2 hours to contest this and parking for $9. We're going to find out in 3, 2, 1. And guess what?
I lost.
It just goes to show you, you can't fight City Hall. Although, in fairness, it was kind of a partial victory. Given my explanation, they reduced the ticket from $170 to $120. Except I was once told by a judge that every day at court in administration costs is about $10,000. That includes the judge's salary, clerk's salary, general real estate, rental, office maintenance, all that sort of stuff. 10 hours a day, so if I divide the day by 8 hours, that's about $1,200. It took me about 2 hours to prepare, 2 hours to go to court to plead it, $9 parking. So I'd say the aggregate hard cost of that entire process was about $2,000 to reduce a ticket by $50. Although had I won, it would have cost the city even more because they would have had to reposition the signs in a manner that was visible, but ultimately the judge came to the conclusion that the signs were visible, and I should have seen it, and I was an idiot for not having seen it, and shame on me. I'm joking, but at the very least now you know a little bit about how to contest a ticket. May you have more success than I, and if you like this content, be sure to like, share, subscribe, hit the notification bell, drop a comment in the comment section below, share my channel with someone who you think might appreciate it, and now you know your vlog, and you just can't beat City Hall. Peace out.